And welcome back, everybody. We are here with George McMillan III, going to continue our talks. Will be the seventh in the series. George, how have you been? Tell us what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about the Russian strategic plan of what they have to do to succeed to have a peaceful divorce from the West. What we've been talking about originally, I started from the premise of John Lewis Gaddis and George Kennan of the original five power center doctrine, where the United States was in the number one position and integrating with Germany in Western Europe and in Japan in the Pacific Ocean. In that situation, it would be the United States in position one, integrating with West Germany in position two, and Japan in power center number three. And the goal was to isolate Russia in power center number four and isolate it from China in power center number five. Now, for this round of discussions, I opted to add India because in the last 70 years, India has become an industrial power. So that's the sixth industrial power center. And I chose to explain it from a Russian-centric point of view, where Russia's in power center number one in the heartland of Mackinder theory, and integrating with the peripheral coastal powers of Germany in power center two, India in power center number three, China in power center number four, and Japan and the Pacific Rim in power center number five. The premise is, had everything been peaceful, the United States did not expand NATO eastward, then Russia would have had full pipeline and infrastructural integration with the other power centers. It would be industrializing and connecting and supplying a lot of cheap energy to the other power centers, and the whole Eurasian bloc would have progressed in an optimal Mackinder type or Haushofer type progression, where Russia does indeed become the center of the global political center of gravity.
Right, we discussed a lot of that in some of the older videos that we did. We have like a playlist going. I'll leave a link somewhere here, and people can catch up with that. And I've also been told not to interrupt you by the commenters on the Telegram chats and in some of the comments on the previous videos. So I'll stop interrupting you and let you get back to it.
Yeah, anyway, let me close this out. What we want to get into it, what we were talking about last time, is with the United States following, Spikeman's theory, they've been trying to split Russia and China into different buffer zone areas. And that would be the Middle East, Central Asia, and anywhere along the periphery. And we're gonna get into that today, with more maps as we get into this. But just to bridge from what we've done to what we're doing now, because the context that this is now occurring in, I like to place it in terms of during the Carter administration, Zbigniew Brzezinski and the Director of Central Intelligence, DCI, Stansfield Turner, he was an admiral in the Navy before he became the DCI of CIA. And they had studied a lot of the evolution of Mackinder theory in the Naval War College. Mackinder, Spikeman, and John Lewis Gaddis had been and George Kennan had studied Spikeman a lot too at Yale. And John Lewis Gaddis had started out in, some small college in Ohio, and then he got picked up by the Naval War College, and then his career really took off. He ended up speaking regularly at the Naval War College, and then eventually started doing a year-long course, multi-credit course on the history of geopolitical and geostrategic theory from Mackinder forward. A lot of people from those programs obviously go straight into government and end into analyst positions and become very high up in government. So some of the people in the chat was wondering why I kept on talking about different frameworks of analysis. Because a lot of this, someone said they were obscure, frameworks or something like that. And no, they're not obscure frameworks. They're the main frameworks of the discipline that are probably only known, in depth by a relatively small group of people. But those are obviously the people that are running the country. So another premise here is democracy is supposed to be, informed consent. And if people don't even know what the policy choices are or where they come from, obviously they're not informed. So obviously there's no informed consent. You get into the question, is this really a democracy? Of course, over the past 2 decades since the global war on terror, I think trust in the media has just plummeted. Trust in alternative media has gone up. The problem with that is you get a lot of news shows, but there's not a lot of analysts doing these programs. So we're trying to address that by having more of a graduate school analyst program here, which is why we're just going to, stick to the boring PowerPoint, death by PowerPoint presentation style, just to stay on point, keep everything on track.
And I'll try and keep my humor under wrap.
Yeah. You do that. All right, so let's get into it here. Yeah, okay, there you go. Yeah, so for everybody that's been following me on Felix Rex during the course of the year, or even actually Felix and I started doing streams when I got out of Afghanistan last September, October. We started to talk about the Middle East a little bit and Central Asia a little bit. We did a show or two on the 3 macro frameworks for my unified behavioral theory, so we could start talking about the population growth problems of the third world. We didn't get back to that, but we will get back to that in this series. And then once the Ukraine war started, I started talking about different aspects of this. And I started taking a lot of my writings off of LinkedIn that I've done while I was in Afghanistan and started moving them over to the Telegram channel. So we've been discussing what originally was an A through J strat plan of Russia back in May over spring. We're wargaming and chatting on this in my Telegram channel. And then it kind of gravitated towards the present A through Q format as this has progressed. And and Russia has not been bankrupted like the mainstream media thought they were going to be. They're actually doing quite well. Several people have gone to videos and done videos walking through shopping malls and grocery stores in Russia, talking about, well, there's plenty of heat, there's plenty of food, and yet the mainstream media says everything is collapsing. And then you look in the number of restaurants and closed stores in Belgium, all of that comes across in our chat channel. And the protests in Western Europe and the protests in the UK, well, the problems seem to be more in the West than they seem to be in the East. They seem to be quite warm in Russia. Of course, they got unlimited amounts of natural gas.
I can second that. I can second that. Having recently been, it's definitely loaded in all the supermarkets, and it's quite amazing what kind of products they have that are supposed to be sanctioned, but they just produce them locally. It's quite amazing.
Yeah.
So like the sanctions have catastrophically backfired.
Oh yeah. And what we've been chatting across, in the Felix Rex cast, I've been talking about several different themes, and we're going to bring them up in detail. But the bottom line is, China and Russia could see this coming, for decades. They've been complaining about the eastward expansion of NATO. There's been a number of bad faith promises made by the U.S. And so Russia, I mean, back in LinkedIn in 2013 and 2014, I was debating a lot of different groups. We were really talking about, the Bush and Obama policies have really been pushing Russia and China together. That was the conversations way back then. And since then, everything the United States does to try to separate Russia and China and the Central Asian stands seems to be pushing them closer and closer together. So that's what this StratPlan is about, because you not only need the railroad, pipeline, port, highway system integration to build your economy, you also need a financial system to do it, and leaving the dollar and moving to a commodities-based trading system has been what Russia and China have been working on, especially China with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And then Russia's had their Eurasian Economic Union to counteract the European Union. So they're trying to make Eurasia a free trade zone. Some of the autocrats in Central Asia, Kemal in Uzbekistan and Turkmenbashi in Turkmenistan, have died. So they were very kind of difficult to deal with, for a lot of different reasons. But since they've been replaced, the newer leaders are much more in favor of having a cooperative, integrative union, Eurasian Economic Union. And China's spent a lot of money in upgrading the old Soviet infrastructure. So it's not just that the United States is trying to stop the Russian integration with the West or the Russian integration with India. China they send about 30 train loads a week, or they were, all the way to Europe on rail, on a northern route, a middle route, and a southern route.
I just want to remind the new viewers that we've got videos detailing everything that George has just touched upon. In case you're interested in more specific topics, there are links everywhere on screen.
Yeah, and we plan to do more shows that actually focus in on each region too. So it's been instead of the StratPlan to intervene in Central Asia and the regime change nation building program of the global war on terror, Russia and China have been increasing their integration. So it's not just Russia, it's also China have been sending 30 train loads of goods a week to the port that they bought on Duisburg, Germany on the Rhine, where they can send everything up and down the Rhine. They can put everything on container ships and send it out the Rhine to the Baltic Sea if they need to, or just continue using the trains or put it on trucks for local deliveries, whatever they want to do. They've been drastically increasing their infrastructural integration So they're increasing their economic integration, their diplomatic integration, and ultimately, in Clausewitzian theory, that always leads to military integration to protect your assets. So it's the dime integration is what's troubling to the West, because if China and Russia integrate the rest of Eurasia, then the global center of gravity moves from Washington and London to Berlin, Moscow, and Beijing. And that would be the ultimate as far as Mackinder's Heartlands theory, if you're looking at it from the Heartland perspective, which is why I renumbered the Six Power Center doctrine. So that's why the United States stopped the nation building program in Afghanistan, and then it looks like they've gone hard towards a destabilization program. Like in the fake Rand Report document, a bunch of people have been, Patrick Lancaster and people like that, and Aaron Mattei and Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone have been talking about the increased military pressure on the Donbass since 2014. And then after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, they really increased it. And so obviously it's to induce military intervention by Russia. So with that as an overview, let's get on to the next slide set here. Let me change it on mine also. Yeah, so all along from the Felix Rex videos on, I've been talking about the arguments between John Mearsheimer, Stephen Cohen, George Kennan, Matlock, and Jeffrey Sachs. They've been against the eastward expansion of NATO because Jeffrey Sachs has always been wanted to do an economic integration, because the more interdependence that countries have in trade, the less likely they are to go to war. The old Kantian peace triangle is what they call it, with economic integration, interdependence, and then international organizations or multilateral organizations to iron out compromises.
This all sounds very familiar to me, but that's because I was here for the last couple of interviews.
Yeah, and
okay, I promise I'm going to stop with the humor or the attempts at it.
Oh no, that's quite all right. Yeah, between that and you've seen all the other shows. So yeah, the next slide set. Yeah, go to the next slide. Slide 4 there. Yeah. So that's this is the eastward expansion of NATO. I think it comes from The Economist. And yeah, the original promise was that NATO would not expand one inch further east. That's been discussed. And they expanded it all the way to, well, the key to getting Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus, if they could, is to block in all the ports and the pipelines coming from Russia, because you only have to hit a few choke points and you can completely shut down 70 or 80% of all Russian exports. And that's what the name of the game here is. So go ahead and go to the next slide, because otherwise I'll get too far ahead, and I've already covered this material in the conclusions. So getting back here is, a lot of people know that NATO is obviously was created to keep the Soviet Union from expanding into Europe. So the purpose of NATO was to keep the U.S. in Europe in order to keep Germany down in Europe to prevent a World War III, and to keep the USSR out of Europe to prevent a World War III. But it looks like now with the regime change, nation building program that failed, that it looks like the United States has gone into a regime change destabilization program. It looks like NATO is in Europe to start World War III. That's what the professors above have been discussing, Mearsheimer, Cohen, and Sachs lately. So, I speak in terms of PMISI and DIME integration. PMISI is political, military, economic, social, infrastructural, informational, and DIME is diplomatic, informational, military, and economic integration. I just use DIME for the purpose of this conversation because it's a little, it's fewer letters, it's a little easier. So, so what the professors and ambassadors were talking about in the previous slide was that the continued expansion of NATO was very adversarial and antagonistic rather than integrative and cooperative, like Jeffrey Sachs had been arguing that the Clinton administration he gave up on talking in the Bush administration. He talks about that a lot in the videos he's done lately. So what a lot of people don't realize is, the different professors in the different areas know their area, but they don't know the ones next to it. But when I was developing my integrated set of political, economic, demographic, geopolitical frameworks, I had to learn a whole bunch of disciplines and how they interact. So that's why I've gone back since the Nord Stream blew up and started to put more of the smaller posts I was doing on LinkedIn or discussions. I started dragging them over to start putting them into full, standalone articles, and then put them into these kind of slide sets so we could go over a lot of it. It was good enough for, the smaller, shorter posts were good enough to get things time and date stamped on LinkedIn, but now let's try to get into a wider audience. That's why I'm talking about that PMISI and DIME analysis, because political and economic development theory is what Jeffrey Sachs discusses. And he's at Harvard, so there's lots of containment theorists there. But what the distinction that we're trying to nuance here is that political and economic development theory is all about increasing cooperation, whereas geostrategic theory is mostly negative, antagonistic, and is really negative sum sabotage behavior, which creates, in behavioral terms, it creates a negative behavioral dynamic, which is where we're going with this. So the purpose of throwing this slide set in there is to show the audience that this is what the different war colleges around the world actually teach, is this geostrategic theory, because the military is there to kill people and break things. If I could quote what Rush Limbaugh there. All right, so this one discusses, the next slide said, that's John Lewis Gaddis. He was, teaching at the War College, like I said before, and he had his lectures at Yale. He did that for decades. And again, I bring that up is because I'm not talking about obscure frameworks here. No, this is what they teach. This is where the different government agencies go to recruit people out of. This is the guy that they bring in to train the new officers. And it's on, I put down George Kennan's American Diplomacy, where he talks about his famous long telegram, which started not started the Cold War, but it was the beginning of United States Cold War policy. George Kennan, biography by John Lewis Gaddis, and a book that I was issued in university, 30 years ago. I didn't have white hair back then, or gray hair. The Strategies of Containment, a critical appraisal of post-war American national security policy. That's a book that's just about assigned to everybody. Well, everybody that studies Cold War theory is what I mean. So Mackinder had the heartland versus rimland, sea power versus land power dual dichotomy theory, and focused on, well, what it took at that time for Russia to integrate with the other powers and actually become a great power, because that was the concern of the Great Game, where the British used its naval power to always try to block in the Russian ports and block them from getting a warm water port in either in the Black Sea or going through Iran and trying to get a warm water port in Iran or Baluchistan through Afghanistan, which is why Hopkirk's book, The Great Game, when he wrote in the late 90s, I think he wrote that, discussed the Great Game at length and how long it's been going on. And boy, getting to Afghanistan back in those days must have been a real chore, going over the different mountain ranges on horseback. But that's been going on for a real long time. So Spikeman was he worked on ships. He was a merchant marine who had been through working with different Dutch companies in Dutch Indonesia, going through the Suez Canal, Straits of Malacca.
We mentioned him in one of our earlier chats, I believe. You discussed him and his story. He was European, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he went back after he left his sailing days in his, about age 40, I guess. And he went to get his PhD at Yale, and so he picked up Mackinder's theories and was advancing that. That was how this geopolitical theory ended up at Yale. It was because of Spikeman. Then Kennan and Brzezinski brought it up also, and it started spreading to other schools, Princeton and places like that. So, of course, the more advances in transportation and logistics because of the train, railroads, steamships, and internal combustion engine, the more the globe started to depend on Middle East oil. And so the more that this whole region in the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, the Caspian region, and the Central Asian stands that are super oil rich and mineral rich become increasingly valuable, to whereas if an industrial power gets cut off from its petroleum supplies, then it ceases to become an industrial power. And once you lose your economic power, because if your logistical supply routes are blocked, it's because your infrastructure has been defeated. So again, you get back into dime integration theory. If you cut off the logistical supply routes, you destroy the logistical infrastructure, then the economy declines, their diplomatic power declines, and their military power declines. Maybe not necessarily in that order, but they all seem to go together. So the incursion into Afghanistan, well, let me back up a second. The United States, it's been debated a lot. The United States could have had its initial invasion and kicked out the Taliban and put in the Northern Alliance. That was all done by October, November of 2001. So why did the United States stay there? And you see that argued in the news a lot. And again, that's why we're going back to the old school geopolitical and geostrategic theories, because it explains why. Particularly Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, because we're there to separate Russia from the Central Asian stands, Russia from China, Russia from Afghanistan, where they can gain a warm water port, Russia from Iran, where they can gain a warm water port through Bandar Abbas and Chabahar is what what the big issues are now. And Matthew Ehrhardt wrote the other day, Eurasia's Middle Corridor, the importance of the integration of China with the Central Asian stands, because with China, you have a lot of east-west infrastructure is what they concentrate on. When you look at Russia and the international north-south trade corridor that goes around either side of the Caspian, presently it's operating mostly out of Bandar Abbas, which is a shallow water port. They want to build a big port in Chabahar, which everybody in Telegram's probably sick of me talking about for 8 months, but that would be a deep water port. So this article talks how the more that Russia and China integrate with their east, west, and north and south infrastructures, the more uneasy it makes for Washington. So the United States stayed in Afghanistan for a long time. The United States could have, I've argued this since 2013, I think we've been arguing on LinkedIn. The United States could have been shipping the minerals up north out of Afghanistan to the railway that the Chinese built into Mazar-e-Sharif. And we could have actually had a constructive integration with Russia and China, but instead we spent over $2.5 trillion on that Afghanistan war, and it didn't end up developing any of the mineral mines there, hardly at all, or exporting it. The United States, it looks like, just basically kept it away from everybody else. Also, I was talking about back in 2012, I was doing some writings on this, where Turkey, with Erdogan in power, has been trying to reestablish the northern part, what I call the northern part of the Ottoman Empire, to reestablish linkages with the Turkic stands, particularly with Azerbaijan. Okay, ethnically, they might be more Persian, but they speak Turkic. Long story there. But what they've always wanted to do was build a tunnel or pipeline system underneath the Caspian Sea. Russia's been blocking that because they want everybody to go through their territory. And he wants to reach out to the other Turkic peoples of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan. Kyrgyz are a little bit different, but you could include Kyrgyzstan also. So he's wanted to reach in to those countries and connect a pipeline system to go through Turkey to get to Europe so he can get his transfer fees. And Erdogan's been trying to organize a Turkic people's, a pan-Turkic organization. So that also overlaps with Russia's Eurasian Economic Union and their security cooperation organization, and also China's Belt and Road Initiative. So you have Turkey's StratPlan to go east, China's strategic plan to go west, and they're converging in the stands. And then you have the Russia-Indian north-south trade corridor going to Iran, and it also goes to Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, obviously on both sides of the Caspian. So they're all converging in Central Asia. The old Silk Road is extremely active again. So let's go down to the next slide. Oh yeah, well, just to throw in the conclusion, the reason why the United States spent so long in Afghanistan is because they couldn't figure out how to make the nation building work, and they didn't want to withdraw, but then it just came to the point where he just couldn't afford to stay there anymore and couldn't figure out what to do, and nobody else was figuring out how to turn it around either. So then Okay, so this is the China, Russia, and Germany. I have it titled here, Haushofer on steroids. Haushofer in the 30s and 40s was reading Mackinder in Germany, and they started developing what would be optimal. Now, if you're looking at efficient use of resources, it would be, well, Russia's got everything that they need. The Germans have always had the Hanseatic League trading in the northeastern Baltic through St. Petersburg for, I don't know, hundreds of years now. And they've always traded down the different rivers that flow into the Baltic, because there's lots of German-speaking pockets of people, trading up and down the rivers for centuries from the Teutonic Knights on. So his idea was, optimally, the Germanic peoples and the Slavic peoples should stop fighting. They should start trading. He also had Lebensraum theory, which is Germany's natural propensity to actually grow outwards, which would, of course, be antagonistic towards the Slavic people, because you're talking about pushing them further east, which a lot of Third Reich strategic plans became focused on. But the other side of the other aspect of his idea was that they should economically integrate, which would just be an extension of the old Hanseatic League. I've been talking about that since the old Felix Rex streams. So in this case, the point of this slide set is, like I mentioned before, you now have not only had a Russian integration with the different pipelines that they built since the 1990s, but with the Chinese building more infrastructure through the stands and then through Iran, and then also to go into Turkey, because Turkey built a new bridge over the Bosphorus and a new railway tunnel that goes underneath. So China, as that Irat article mentioned, China had the Northern Railroad route operable first. They've been working on improving the railroad system through the middle routes going through the stands in the South Caucasus regions. You have to upgrade the old Soviet system here, but they've also have gotten the train system going through Iran and Turkey much more functional, which these efforts are much more of a diplomatic feat than they are an engineering feat, because the land is relatively flat. So it's engineering-wise, it's mostly easy. It's getting along with the different personalities involved. That's the problem. So the Chinese have been patient with that and slowly building up. So yeah, the conclusion here was, as there's many videos on it, the China is sending 30 train loads of goods back and forth between Duisburg, Germany. A lot of German automobile manufacturing plants have moved to Germany. So moved from Germany to also have assembly plants and manufacturing plants in China. So a lot of stuff goes back and forth. They've been working on integrating both economies and making sure the trains are full going both directions. So it's not only the integration of Russia with everything, but China, Germany, Russia, and China is becoming such a huge powerhouse. It's very concerning if the focus is on the shifting of the global political center of gravity. All right, let's go to the next slide set. The next slide at slide 10. Yeah. So, yeah, because we're going to stop about slide 17 here. Okay. Yeah, I threw the piece in here about Brian Berlick because he covers it the most. He covers this aspect very well, actually. So, again, we talked about it before. We don't do plagiarism on this show. The National Endowment of Democracy has been in charge of, it's supposed to be expanding democratic institutions. The paradox is during the Clinton administration, as Jeffrey Sachs has been, and Stephen Cohen have been arguing. Okay, Stephen Cohen's the late Stephen Cohen, I should say. What they were arguing is the United States did a lot to put the oligarchs in power in Eastern Europe and in Russia, instead of going towards a perfect competition and try to spread out power. The reason why oligarchs are easy to deal with is because there's fewer of them, so they're easier to control. It's not like herding cats in perfect competition, but more importantly, they induce them. If you have a high capital concentration, a few rich people, and they're putting their money into Wall Street banks and into the City of London banks and into Swiss banks, then obviously the Western banking centers are the people that are winning. Who's losing is Russia doesn't economically advance because the money isn't going to build up factories inside Russia. I was in Dubrovnik back in, I think that was in 2018 at an economics conference for the International Institute of Interdisciplinary Social and Economic Sciences, and the economics professors were there in this, in Croatia. They were talking about, every time they have a good idea and want to build a factory, as soon as they go to the Western capital markets to get an investment team together, to get $10 million or $50 million to go build a factory, well, the different London or Paris, investment houses or Swiss investment houses, they all want to build in Southeast Asia wherever there's cheap labor. And the Croatians were talking about, well, how can we ever develop and get anywhere? And frankly, they were talking about, well, why bother being in the European Union if you can't build your factories inside the European Union? So that's it may not be discussed in the media a lot, but there certainly is a lot of discussion on that behind the scenes.
Yeah, that's true. Right. There's definitely a lot of talk about how deindustrialization, let's say, is forced by the EU upon other, member states.
Yeah, and there's different reasons why. I mean, it not only increases investment capital, but the other aspect is it never lets any of those countries become a power.
Yeah, they can't be competitive basically on the world stage or even locally.
Yeah, even in Serbia where you are, China's been doing more investment there with the railroads than the European Union almost.
Yeah, that's true.
Again, they're trying to build the railroads going back and forth between China and get all the way over to Germany so they can trade with everybody else, and also be immune from U.S. naval interdiction on the different naval choke points. But they are talking about these routes may be a little bit more expensive to send stuff by train, but it gets there a few weeks faster. And these projects are really improving China's diplomatic power, because the more that the individual companies between countries, when they get used to working with each other, everything else between those two countries, relationship-wise, also improves. So when you go through these different, just shipping stuff back and forth, countries become much more integrated and get along with each other's different cultural differences a lot easier. So that's been a concern. And actually, with the discussion before, I was talking about with Brian Berlick's channel, the National Endowment for Democracy has actually been there to stir up protest movements. In the United States, people talk about identity politics, how it's increased antagonisms between groups in North America. Well, the National Endowment for Democracy and those groups were also stirring up age-old ethnic rivalries everywhere else they go to also. So it's not just, they do the same thing here, they do the same thing there. I think that's one of Brian's topics that he talks about, and there's a lot of evidence to support that. So, okay, which slide you at now? Okay, 13.
We're at slide 11.
Oh, okay, yes. Oh, okay. Oh, slide 11, I'm sorry. All right, so this slide set, the citations here are kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke, because a lot of people haven't heard of the Mackinder Speakman's Heartland and Rimland theory, and this is added in there to show that the information I'm giving everybody is so absolutely top secret that this young guy over here has developed these courses for AP high school history.
I was in AP high school history when I was of age to be in AP high school history. But yeah, I took that class long ago.
Yeah. So this is, I'm providing such top secret information that this guy here teaches this for high school students. I think it's kind of funny. I got a kick out of it. Because there's so many people in the DC area that have no idea about the Stott lineage, and they're actually the decision makers that know about this, and it's a very small group, obviously. If the rest of DC is totally unfamiliar with it.
It's like that with many topics. It's like that with many topics. A lot of people are clueless as to what they should know. Be they engineers or politicians or the scientists. We've learned that trust the science means nothing anymore.
Oh, yeah. Well, you're supposed to debate the sciences, the process.
Yeah.
Careful observation and theoretical reformulation. But, yeah, getting back into it here, this is a different, this girl, Tracy Lyon, did this for, I forget which, was it, I forget which university she did this at. But she did this 5 years ago. And I included this here because she had a really good map, gave a good presentation in her interview. I mean, in her video done years ago for, I guess it was graduate school or whatever she's in. But this was very prophetic because she was talking about all the different infrastructural programs that were in place in 2017. And I thought it was good, and I included it because, yeah, it's done 5 years ago. She didn't put it in context that she didn't put it in the geostrategic context of why Russia and China are trying to avoid U.S. naval interdiction, and they're really irritated by the regime change policies of the West, whether it be regime change, nation building, or regime change, destabilization. I know on our Telegram channel the other day, we had some discussions of whether when you actually start looking at go year by year through the global war on terror, one person was arguing whether we were ever in a regime change, nation building era. And I was like, well, at least for 2 years until 2005. You could certainly say that maybe since then we started the destabilization strategy, but also, but then what do you call staying in Afghanistan for so long? That's probably more of an indecision than a policy. I know that old show Homeland on HBO, where Peter Quinn, the actor in the show, was the Special Activities Division CIA guy in the show. He goes to Syria to do a whole bunch of stuff, and his famous quote was that he goes back to CIA headquarters in the show, and they asked him, "Hey, is our Syrian policy working?" And his answer was, "Well, you tell me what the policy is, and then I'll tell you whether it's working or not, because right now nobody can figure out what they're doing." I bring that up because it's a popular sentiment.
Has no correlation to reality. It's just Hollywood, right?
Yeah, it's between the different administrations. I mean, I argue that we were in a sincere regime change, nation building strategy all along, and then Rumsfeld, I think Cheney were over optimistic. Obviously, I don't know. I was over optimistic too. I'm not going to sit here and Monday morning quarterback. I was overly optimistic until I actually, started working there. So then you become very pessimistic. So yeah, somewhere in there you can see how pessimism goes over, and then do you just withdraw and leave and have a defeat, or whether do you actually try to go back to destabilization program of Operation Cyclone, those Zbigniew Brzezinski, and start actually arming the Sunni violent extremist organization. So let's go down to, okay, yeah. So just to finish up that slide, she's got a real good picture of the railroads going back and forth between China, Russia, and Central Asia, and there's a whole bunch of pipelines there too, obviously, that we'll discuss. Okay, yeah. So we're going to start to end the first half of this slide set, but the purpose of this was to get a more objective PAMISI dime SWOT analysis. SWOT analysis is strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats of any given venture. So instead of just being rah, Russia's going to collapse any minute now, someone's going to assassinate Putin any minute now, all the world leaders are against Putin and they want to get him out of power. Meanwhile, all the leaders are flocking to Moscow to sign deals, especially Modi and Xi. So none of that's turned out to be right. So we really want to give a more objective, balanced view here, because, like I said, democracy is supposed to be informed consent, with the operative word being informed. And unless you're understand the history of the policy options, well, then you're not informed, so there's no consent. It's not a democracy. So yeah, going down to go to slide 14.
All right, I skipped ahead when you mentioned the democracy part.
Right. Yeah, I just want to hit. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I want to hit these two articles because Wolfowitz did his paper in his national security paper in 1992, but it's titled for fiscal years 94 through 99. And then that was the one that was the show that we did the other day. And on the fake Rand report, and what's the basis of that? And I talked about that paper a little bit. We're not going to talk about it very much here because we're going to talk about the next set of papers that came as an extension of that. So the idea there was you can either economically integrate, but the United States has to become the sole superpower. So if you're going to do that kind of a balance, you want living standards to improve a little bit, but not too much in Eastern Europe, to where people can become, where the countries can become autarkic and act on their own and not follow the United States. So that's the balance here. So in that regards, the goal here was to break apart Russia in terms of different republics and different oblasts and different other units that they have there. And then if you're doing individual deals with all these different regions within the Russian Federation, the advantage to that is the Western oil companies could probably get much better prices by doing it that way. John McCain had called Russia the biggest gas station. So if you're going to use that analogy, they're trying to separate Russia from its customers. They're also trying to, if you're going to use the U.S. Standard Oil Trust, where Rockefeller had put all the smaller companies together and combined them, actually the price of gas and oil at the pump actually dropped under Rockefeller because he gained efficiencies. He actually didn't get a monopoly and raise prices. But the concern is you get a monopoly and you raise prices instead of lower them. So in this case, they wanted to break apart. The idea was to break apart Russia, separate it from its republics, the different oblasts, have them all compete against each other on the global market and try to get a collapse in oil prices. What the United States, in that sense, is trying to reduce is the United States, during the 1973 Arab oil embargo, that really caused a lot of inflation during the end of the Vietnam War. So it made it difficult to prosecute the Vietnam War while politicians are also trying to get reelected in the United States, and you have rising prices, and you get inflation, then you get recession, and you get higher interest rates. People's car loans go up, people's mortgages go up, causes a lot of problems. So the idea is not to get in a situation where there's more Arab oil embargoes like in 73 and 78 and 79. So these are two RAND articles that you can download that discuss purposely trying to induce Russia into a conflict where they start devoting so much resources to it that they become financially unstable. These were produced in 2019, but by 2014, with the Euromaidan revolution that we discussed, it was apparent to everybody in Eurasia what the United States was doing. And all the different countries started trying to figure out how to protect themselves. And again, they're going to protect themselves. You need to replace international markets with internal divestment and internal markets. And like I discussed in the Felix Rex shows, you got 1.4 billion people in India. You got 1.4 billion people in China. You have 270 million people in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and then millions of people in the rest of Southeast Asia. So Eurasia as a whole has billions of people in it. You have big enough markets there that if they redirect their energies, they can trade amongst themselves, keep the profits internal, and build each other's economies. And that's what's been transpiring. So these articles here are about how to disrupt that and make everybody dependent upon the United States, is the gist of that. All right, just a couple of slide sets and we'll stop, or slides rather than we'll stop. So yeah, Jeffrey Sachs has been speaking about this a lot, which he knows that's made him unpopular. And, it hasn't really made me too popular either, on a much lower level, obviously. But we gave, on these slide set series or these videos that we're doing, we're trying to get both sides of the argument out there so people can see what the different policy choices are. Yeah, okay, so Sachs has been talking about the United States has spent billions of dollars influencing elections over there, exporting conflict over there, and meanwhile, Trump wins the election, they start talking about Russian and Chinese influence in the United States elections. It's very, it's hypocritical on a lot of levels. Okay. Moving to slide set 16. All right. Yeah, this is in context of it's not just the European free trade agreement with Ukraine that's a problem. As the EU's been expanding east, if they can't readily move NATO east, they've been putting NATO military standards clauses in all the EU documents, because had NATO disappeared out in the mid 1990s and just the European Union had moved, or the European community moved over, you could have moved economic and political development and even stipulated, well, you need to disrupt economic power and political power. You need to diversify it. So they could have stipulated democratic and economic liberalizations without moving the military components in. So in that case, what's the purpose of NATO? Well, it's become increasingly, where we're going to end up with this on slide 50, is become to make sure that Western companies are running all the pipeline systems so they can get the property, get the profits from that, redirect the pipelines, you redirect the profits. Hunter Biden and Devin Archer on the boards of Burisma, those are the two big examples. And the Caspian Sea pipeline, it's done by British Petroleum, going from Baku to Tbilisi, Georgia, to Kars, or even out to Batumi. So they make sure that Western companies get all the oil extraction, natural gas extraction, and pipeline and railway distribution contracts. But most importantly is to ensure that everybody trades in the petrodollar. Here also I threw in the policy choice not taken is the intermarium region, where you make the Baltic states, Poland and Ukraine, a buffer zone where they get to do free trade in either directions, but they militarily stay neutral. That was one of the options. Caspian Report did a video on it several years ago. I talked about that on the Felix Rex show from the beginning. All right, now let's go down to 17. Yeah, so here again, I'm going to conclude it with, the democratic processes are based on informed consent. If people don't get the accurate information, and a small group of economic and political elites hoard that information, then it's just not a democracy. So again, the point here is to provide the information so we can have informed consent to actually become more democratic, if that's the goal.
Excellent.
We'll end here on. Say again?
I said excellent. Excellent summary.
Yeah, I'll just end here on 2018 just to tell people where we're going with this. So the whole question of the second half of this slide set is going to be, what steps does the United States have to go through to weaken Germany? To weaken Germany, weaken Russia, weaken Chinese integration. So then what does Russia and China have to do to counteract that? So then you can start judging where we are in the process as far as, are they going to win? Because if Russia and China integrate, then then more people leave the petrodollar trading system, which looks like it's what's going to happen. Then you're going to have much higher levels of inflation here. So we'll end on that note here, and we'll pick it up at slide 18 in the when we get to section 2.
Excellent. Thank you, George. Very concise. I'll leave it there without any cheesy remarks. Thank you, everybody who stayed until the end, and we will continue this soon.
All right. Cheers.